The morning Martha Boone walked 3 miles through red Kansas dust to borrow a plow from a man she had never met. She had no way of knowing that the errand would become the most important journey of her life. It was the spring of 1874, and the Oklahoma and Kansas territories were blooming with a kind of wild, desperate beauty that only the frontier knew how to produce. The land stretched out in every direction like a bolt of fabric that God had thrown from the sky without bothering to fold it neatly, and the grass moved in long amber waves under a sun that already, at 8:30 in the morning, meant business. Martha walked with her bonnet tied tight beneath her chin, her dark brown hair pinned up under it, and her skirts dusted already to the knee from the dry road that wound between her property and the Alden place. She was 26 years old, and she had been a widow for 7 months. Her husband, Thomas Boone, had died of a fever in October, leaving her with 40 acres of Kansas land, a 2-room sod house, a mule named Eli who was disagreeable on good days and outright mutinous on bad ones, $12 in a tin box under the floorboards, and a plow that had cracked clean through the wooden beam 2 weeks before planting season. Thomas had been a decent man and a passable farmer, but he had not been much of a planner, and there was no one in Martha's immediate vicinity who could lend her the means to break new ground in time to get a crop in before the growing season passed her by, except for Jedediah Alden. She had heard his name spoken in town, at the dry goods store, and at the little white church that served the scattered homesteaders of the county. People spoke of him in the particular way that small communities speak of someone they respect and are slightly uncertain about. He had arrived in 1871, purchased land outright from a speculator, built a house and a barn with his own hands and the help of some hired men, and proceeded to farm it so well that in 3 years he had become the most productive operation within 20 miles. He was not the kind of man who came into town every Saturday to drink and carouse. He was not the kind of man who inserted himself into other people's business. He was simply there doing his work, and doing it exceptionally. He was also, as the widow Pearson at the church had mentioned once with a meaningful look over the tops of her spectacles, unmarried. Martha had not thought about that when she set out from her property that morning. She had thought about her field, about the dark earth that had been resting all winter and was ready to be turned, about the seeds she had already purchased and stored in burlap sacks in the corner of the house. She had thought about whether she could manage it, a woman alone on the frontier. She thought about that constantly, in the way a person thinks about a wound that has not properly healed. The Alden property came into view around a long, gentle bend in the road, and Martha stopped for a moment at the top of a low rise to look at it. She had not expected what she saw. The house was a real house, not a sod house, timber-framed and whitewashed, with a proper covered porch running along the front of it. There was a barn to the east, large and well-maintained, and a series of fenced paddocks in which several horses moved in the early morning light. The fields were enormous, extending away to the south in long, precise rows that had already been worked. The furrows were straight as surveyor's lines, and the soil looked dark and rich and recently turned. He had already plowed his own fields. Good, that meant the plow would be available. Martha squared her shoulders and walked down toward the house. She had nearly reached the gate in the low split-rail fence that marked the house yard when a man came around the corner of the barn carrying what appeared to be a saddle blanket over one arm and a bucket in the other hand. He stopped when he saw her. He was tall, with broad shoulders that tapered to a lean waist, and he wore the clothes of a working man: sturdy canvas trousers, suspenders over a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows, and boots that were dusty but well-made. He had dark hair that was slightly longer than was fashionable, dark eyes that caught the morning light in a way that made them seem almost amber, and a jaw that carried 2 or 3 days of stubble. He looked to be somewhere in his early 30s, perhaps 32 or 33. He looked at her with an expression that was curious but not unfriendly, and he set the bucket down on the ground. "Morning," he said, His voice was low and even, with a cadence that suggested he had not grown up on the frontier, or at least not entirely. "Good morning," Martha said. She stopped at the gate. "I am looking for Jedediah Alden." "You have found him," the man said. "My name is Martha Boone. My property is about 3 miles that direction." She pointed back the way she had come. "I was married to Thomas Boone. He passed last October." Something shifted in Jedediah Alden's expression, a brief lowering of the eyes that suggested genuine acknowledgement rather than the polite performance of it. "I am sorry for your loss, Mrs. Boone." "Thank you." She held the gate with one hand and looked at him steadily. She had decided on the walk over that she would be direct, because she did not have time or energy for anything else. "I have come to ask whether you might lend me the use of your plow. My own is broken, and I have 40 acres that need breaking before I can plant, and the season is already moving. I can pay you something for the trouble, not much, but something, or I can offer labor in exchange. I am a hard worker." Jedediah Alden looked at her for a long moment, not in a rude way but in the way of a man who was accustomed to thinking before he spoke. Then he reached past her and opened the gate. "Come in, Mrs. Boone," he said. "Let me offer you some water after your walk and we can talk about it." She had not expected that. She had expected him to simply say yes or no at the gate. But she stepped through because that was what a person did when a door was opened, and she followed him toward the house. The inside of Jedediah Alden's house was surprising. It was neat, first of all, in the way that a man's house is rarely neat without a woman's help, which told her something about him. There was a cast iron stove against one wall, a solid table of good quality pine in the center of the room, 3 chairs, a bookshelf that held a dozen volumes that she could see from across the room, and on the windowsill, a tin can with a bunch of dry wildflowers stuck in it that had probably been there since the summer. There was a rug on the floor, worn but clean. He poured her water from a pitcher and set it in front of her on the table without ceremony, and then sat down across from her, his forearms resting on the tabletop in a way that was open and direct. "Tell me about the plow," he said. She told him. The crack in the beam, the time she had spent trying to find someone to repair it, the cost of a new one that was beyond what she could manage until she had a harvest to sell. She spoke plainly and without requesting sympathy, because sympathy was not what she needed. He listened without interrupting. When she was finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I have 2 plows. The spring work on my south field is done. I do not need the second plow for anything until the fall breaking, and by then you will be done with it." He paused. "I will not take payment from you, Mrs. Boone." "I will not accept charity," she said immediately. "It is not charity," he said. "It is neighboring. There is a difference." She looked at him across the table. He met her gaze without flinching, and she found something in his expression that she had not expected to find. Not pity, something more like respect. "Then I will return the favor when the opportunity presents itself," she said. "That is what neighboring means." "Agreed," he said. He took her out to the barn and showed her the plow, a good iron-tipped walking plow in solid condition, better than the one she had lost. He explained the adjustment of the coulter, which she already knew, but let him explain anyway because he was being thorough and not condescending about it. He helped her with the harness arrangement for her mule, suggesting a modification that would make the pulling easier on Eli, and she stored that detail away because it was genuinely useful. When the plow was ready, loaded onto a small borrowed wagon he said she could keep for the week, he walked with her to the gate. The sun was higher now, and the light had shifted from the soft gold of early morning to the brighter white of midday approaching. "Mrs. Boone," he said at the gate. She turned. "If you have trouble with the mule or with the equipment or anything else," he said, "you are welcome to come back. I will not be offended by the asking." She looked at him. "Thank you, Mr. Alden," she said. "I am not generally in the habit of asking for help." "I know," he said. It was a strange thing to say, given that they had only just met, but it did not sound presumptuous. It sounded like he had simply recognized something in her, the way you sometimes do with people. She took the wagon and walked the 3 miles home through the red dust. And she did not let herself think about his eyes or the way he had said "I know," until after she had unhitched the wagon and fed the mule and eaten her supper. Then she sat in the doorway of her sod house with a cup of weak coffee and the last of the evening light on the horizon, and she thought about it for a short while, and then she put it away, because she had 40 acres to break, and that was what mattered. The plowing took her 4 days. It was the hardest physical work she had done in her life, and she had grown up on a farm in Missouri and was not unfamiliar with labor. Walking behind a plow all day, guiding it through the thick Kansas sod that wanted to resist and close back over itself, managing Eli, who was in a state of chronic protest about the whole enterprise, came close to breaking her more than once. Her back ached so deeply that she could feel it in her teeth. Her hands blistered and then hardened. She fell into bed each night like a stone dropped from a height, but the furrows were straight, and on the 4th day, she turned the last corner of the last row, and the field was done, and she stood at the edge of it with the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows from the newly turned earth, and she felt something she had not felt in 7 months. Something that was not quite happiness and not quite hope, but was the precursor to both. She returned the plow on the 5th day. She had thought about this more than she should have, which irritated her. She had thought about what to say, whether to bring something, whether a woman returning a borrowed plow to a single man would occasion comment from anyone who happened to see. She had concluded that the frontier was too spread out and too pragmatic for anyone to care, and that she was being foolish, and she had made a small pan of cornbread to bring because it was only polite to bring something when returning a borrowed item, and then she had set out. Jedediah Alden was in his field when she arrived, doing something with one of the fence posts at the edge of a paddock. He looked up when he heard the wagon and came over, pulling off his gloves as he walked. "The plowing is done," Martha said before he could speak. "The plow is in perfect condition. I oiled the iron." He looked at the plow in the wagon bed and then at her, and something in his expression did a quiet, interesting thing that she could not quite name. "How did it go?" he asked. "4 days," she said. "The mule was uncooperative, but the field is broken. All 40 acres. All 40 acres." He looked at her for a moment with that quiet directness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him. "That is remarkable, Mrs. Boone." "It is necessary," she said, which was the same thing in 1874 Kansas. She handed him the pan of cornbread, wrapped in a cloth. "Thank you for the loan," she said. "I mean it." He took the cornbread and looked down at it, and something passed over his face that was softer than his usual expression. "You did not have to do this. My mother taught me that when someone does you a kindness, you acknowledge it," Martha said. "Cornbread is how I acknowledge things." The ghost of a smile crossed his face. It was the first time she had seen it, and it changed his whole aspect, made him look younger and more open, and she felt something shift slightly inside her chest, like a door swinging on a rusty hinge. "Will you have some water?" he said. "Or I can make coffee. I have real coffee." She should have said no. She had seeds to get into the ground. She had 100 things to do. But the morning was cool, and the cornbread was a conversational offering as much as a culinary one, and she found herself saying yes. They sat on his porch, which had 2 wooden chairs facing the fields, and they drank coffee and ate pieces of the cornbread and talked. Not about anything significant. About the weather, about what she was planning to plant, about his horses, about the town and its various characters. He was a better listener than he was a talker, but when he did speak, what he said was worth hearing. He had come from Virginia originally, he told her, had been west since 1868, had spent a year in Colorado before settling in Kansas. "What brought you to farming?" she asked. "You do not seem like someone who was always a farmer." He looked at her with an expression that said he was slightly surprised she had noticed, and then he said, "I was a soldier before, after the war, and then I was done with that and I wanted something I could build instead of break." He paused. Farming seemed like the honest work. She thought about that. "It is honest," she said. Sometimes brutally so. He looked at her and the ghost smile came back. Yes, he said, that is exactly right. She left an hour later with seeds in the ground of her thoughts, though not yet in her field, and on the walk home she admitted to herself that she had liked talking to him. Liked it in the uncomplicated way that she used to like things, before grief had made everything complicated. She had liked the steadiness of him, the way he did not perform anything, did not say things to impress her or to fill silence, did not treat her like a fragile object because she was a widow. He had talked to her like a person, which was rarer than it should have been. 3 weeks later, she was in her field doing the planting, working her way down the long rows, her seed bag over one shoulder, when she became aware that she was not alone. She straightened and turned, and Jedediah Alden was at the edge of her property, mounted on a large bay horse, watching her with his hat pushed back on his head. "Mr. Alden," she said, shading her eyes with one hand. "Mrs. Boone," he said, "I was riding past and I noticed you are still in the south section." "How long have you been out here today?" She looked up at the sun. "Since before 6. He swung down from the horse in one easy motion and walked toward her. "You have covered a good amount of ground," he said, looking at the rows she had done. "But this section will take you another full day at the pace you are working. I am aware of that." He looked at her for a moment. "Would you allow me to help? I have the morning free." She wanted to say no. The independence she had spent the last 7 months building was a thing she was protective of, because it was the only thing between her and the particular despair of feeling helpless. But she looked at the remaining ground, and she thought about her back, and she thought about the rain that the sky to the west was possibly suggesting might arrive by afternoon. "You did not have to ride out here to check on me," she said, which was not a yes but was not a no. "I was not checking on you," he said. "I was riding past." But there was a slight quality to the way he said it that suggested this might not be the full truth, and they both knew it, and neither of them commented on it. She handed him the spare seed sack. They worked side by side down the rows, not talking much because the work required attention, but conscious of each other in the specific way of two people who have agreed without discussing it that they would like to be in each other's company. When they came to the end of a row and turned, they were close enough that she could see the individual lines of his hands and the way his jaw set with concentration. And once when they reached for the same fence post at the boundary marker, their hands brushed and they both stopped for a fraction of a second before stepping apart. At noon, they ate the bread and dried meat she had brought from the house, sitting in the shade of the property's one large oak tree, and they talked more than they had before. She told him about Missouri, about her father's farm there, about Thomas, carefully and without excessive sentiment. He told her about Virginia, about what the war had done to the land there and to the people, about coming west with the feeling of needing to get as far as possible from something he could not entirely name. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Virginia. I miss the idea of it," he said. "What it was before everything, but that place does not exist anymore." He looked at the Kansas horizon, at the grass moving in the warm breeze. "This place is what it is. It does not pretend to be anything else." She understood that completely and said so, and he looked at her with the amber eyes, and she felt the hinges of that interior door swing again, wider this time. That afternoon, dark clouds did roll in from the west, and by 2 o'clock the sky had turned a greenish gray that every Kansas farmer knew to take seriously. They hurried to finish the last 2 rows, working quickly now, and when the first fat drops began to fall, they had just covered the last of the seeds, and Martha stood up from the final row and the rain hit her full in the face and she laughed. She could not help it. It was a real laugh, whole and sudden, the kind she had not produced in a very long time. Jedediah Alden looked at her laughing in the rain in his field, with her bonnet sliding back from the water and her face turned up, and something happened to his expression that was nothing like his usual composure, something that he quickly rearranged, though not quite quickly enough. "We should get to the house," he said. They ran for her sod house as the rain came properly, and crowded inside the doorway while the rain hammered the dirt outside and turned the road to mud in a matter of minutes. The sod house was cramped with 2 adults in the entry, and she could feel the warmth of him close beside her. She kept her eyes on the rain. "You should wait out the weather," she said. "It will not be long this kind." "I should get back," he said, but he did not move. "Your horse is already soaked," she pointed out, which was true. The bay was standing at the fence with its ears flat and an expression of deep reproach. "Waiting 10 minutes will not make a difference." "No," he agreed. "I suppose not." They stood there while the rain blew through, close enough that she could hear him breathing, and neither of them said anything, which was its own kind of conversation. When the rain lightened and then stopped, he looked at her, and she looked at him, and the air between them had something in it that had not been there that morning. He put his hat back on and stepped out into the mud, and he said, "The seeds will be well watered." "They will," she agreed. "Mrs. Boone." He stood by the fence with his horse, one hand on the saddle horn. "Would it be acceptable if I called again, without a particular errand?" She looked at him. The afternoon was golden now, post-storm gold, the light hitting everything slant and bright, and he was standing in it. This man who had lent her a plow and helped her plant and ridden past out of a concern he would not quite name. And she thought about what it meant and whether she was ready for it to mean anything, and she thought about the 7 months of difficulty, and she thought about the way her chest had felt when he laughed, which was not something she had asked for. "Yes," she said, "that would be acceptable." Yes. He nodded once, with a gravity that suggested he understood what had just passed between them, and he mounted his horse and rode away through the mud, and she stood in her doorway and watched him go with her heart doing something that was quietly complicated and also, for the first time in a long time, not unpleasant. He came 2 weeks later on a Sunday afternoon, wearing what she recognized as his better clothes, a dark coat and a clean shirt, and carrying his hat in his hands when she opened the door. Behind him, tied to the fence, was a second horse, a gentle-looking mare. "I thought you might like to ride out and see the river bend," he said. "There are cottonwood trees there that are remarkable in the spring, but if you have other things needing doing, I understand completely." She looked at him standing there with his hat in his hands, and she thought that there was something very earnest and very careful about Jedediah Alden, and that she liked it. "Give me 5 minutes," she said. She changed into her slightly less working dress, pinned her hair differently, and came out to find him waiting by the horses with a patience that was entirely without impatience, if that could be said to be a thing. The mare was well-mannered and the ride was easy, and the cottonwood trees along the river bend were exactly as remarkable as he had promised, tall and pale-trunked with the new spring leaves trembling like pieces of light in the afternoon air. They dismounted and walked along the bank, and the conversation moved easily from one thing to another, ranging over a country of subjects in the way that it does when two people are discovering that they could talk about nearly anything together. She learned more about him. He had a sister in Richmond who wrote letters that arrived months late and were full of news about people he had never met. He had been engaged once, years ago before the war, to a girl who had married someone else while he was away, which he had come to understand was probably for the best for everyone. He read more than most men she knew, and had opinions about what he read, and when she told him that she also read, and mentioned the authors she preferred, he turned and looked at her with an expression of genuine delight that made her feel as though she had said something unexpectedly wonderful. "You have read George Eliot?" He said, "Middlemarch," she said. 3 times. He stopped walking. 3 times, he repeated. "The first time for the story," she said. "The second time for the sentences. The third time I was trying to understand how she did it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with an expression she was beginning to catalogue, the one where something internal was happening that he was deciding whether to say. Then he said, "That is the most interesting thing anyone has said to me in this territory." She laughed, and it was the real laugh again, and she saw what it did to his expression, and she filed that away too. They rode back in the early evening with the sky going rose and copper behind them and the smell of the river grass on the air. And when he helped her down from the mare at her gate, his hands were at her waist for a moment, brief and careful, and she was aware of every single second of it. He came back the following Sunday, and the one after that, and by the fourth Sunday it was no longer a formal ride, but simply an afternoon, shifting and natural, sometimes at her property and sometimes at his, sometimes in town when they had both gone to church, and then walked down the main street together in a way that was noted and discussed and generally approved of by the congregation at large. Reverend Coleman's wife said to Martha, quietly but not so quietly that the women nearby could not hear, that Jedediah Alden was a fine man, and that it was no sin to be happy again, which was kindly meant and only slightly presumptuous. The widow Pearson, who had originally mentioned Alden's unmarried status with that meaningful look, was now openly satisfied with herself. There was a man in town named Cullen Bryce, who ran the feed store and who had made his own awkward attentions known to Martha during the winter months, and who did not take warmly to the development. He said something to Jedediah one afternoon in early June outside the dry goods store, something with an edge to it about men who collected other men's leftovers, and Jedediah looked at him with a very quiet steadiness that was more intimidating than any raised voice, and said, "That is an ugly way to speak about a woman of quality, and I would not say it again." Cullen Bryce looked at him for a moment, found something in the level dark eyes that he did not want to test, and moved on. Martha, who had heard it from the doorway of the store where she was waiting for her order, came out when Bryce was gone and stood beside Jedediah, and after a moment said, "You did not need to do that." "I wanted to," he said. She looked at him. His jaw was still set from it, and there was a heat in his face that she had not seen before, and she understood that the steadiness and the calm were not the absence of passion but the containment of it, and that understanding shifted something in her significantly. "Thank you, Jedediah," she said. She had not used his given name before. It fell out before she thought about it. He turned and looked at her, and something changed in his face entirely, softened and opened, and he said quietly, "Martha." It was only their names, but it was also everything. June became July, and the crops were coming up beautifully, her corn and his wheat, and they spent time together with a frequency and a naturalness that had long since ceased to be unusual, and had become simply the shape of their days when they could arrange it. She helped him mend fence one Saturday, and he helped her with the roof of her storage shed that was developing an alarming relationship with gravity, and they ate supper together twice a week, alternating between her table and his. And on those evenings the conversation moved from reading to farming to history to personal things that they were slowly and carefully learning about each other. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes from the war, and that he never spoke about them directly, but sometimes she could see the traces of a difficult night in his eyes at church on Sunday mornings. And she learned not to ask, but to simply sit next to him and let the hymns do what they could. He learned that she was fiercely private about certain things and would communicate her feelings sometimes only in action, that if she was frightened or uncertain, she became very efficient and practical about whatever was at hand, and that if you paid attention, you could read the whole interior of her by watching her hands. One evening in late July, they were sitting on his porch after supper, watching the sun go down, and he reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair. Just that. No words. She turned her hand and held his, and they sat there until the stars came out, and she thought that this was one of the most contented she had ever felt, which frightened her a little, because contentment was something she had thought she might not feel again. "What are you thinking?" he said into the dark. "I am thinking that I am going to have to deal with the fence on the north side of the property before the fall, because it is in poor repair," she said, which was also true, but was not the whole of what she was thinking. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Martha, yes, I think you know what I want to say." She looked at the stars. The night insects were loud and the air was warm and full, and the lamp from the house threw a long gold shape across the porch boards. "I think I do," she said. "Are you ready to hear it?" She considered that honestly, the way she tried to be honest about things. She thought about Thomas, about grief, about the 7 months she had spent rebuilding something in herself. She thought about the way she felt sitting here, hand in hand with this man, and the way she felt when she woke up in the morning and thought of the next time she would see him. "I think I am," she said, "though I may not be able to say much in response just yet." "That is all right," he said. He turned in his chair to look at her, and his face in the lamplight was very serious and very open. "I love you, Martha. I have loved you since you stood at my gate and said you did not accept charity and looked at me like you were prepared to have an argument about it. I did not know it was love right then, but that is when it started and it has not stopped." She felt something in her chest that was large and warm and also made her throat very tight. She looked at him. "That was the moment," she said. "You had walked 3 miles in the dust to ask for help and you were still standing straight as a flagpole," he said. "Yes, that was the moment." She squeezed his hand and then she said, "I cannot say it back to you tonight, Jedediah. I want to, and I think it is close to true, but I will not say it until I am certain, because I would rather wait and mean it fully than say it before it is completely ready." "That is the most honest thing anyone has ever said to me," he said. "I am a very honest person," she said. "I know," he said, and his voice was warm with it. They sat a while longer, and when she rode home on the mare he had gotten into the habit of lending her, she rode through the dark Kansas night with her heart very full and her mind working through something that felt increasingly like the clear approach of a decision. It took her 3 more weeks. It took a Tuesday afternoon when she was hoeing between the corn rows and he appeared at the edge of the field, not on horseback this time but on foot, having walked from his property for no particular reason except, as he said, "I found myself wanting to walk in this direction." And he took the second hoe from where it leaned against the fence and worked the next row while she worked hers, and they talked about books and about whether the county needed a better schoolhouse. And she watched him work with the easy competence that he brought to everything, and she thought about a life, a full one, with this man in it, and she thought about what it would mean to choose that and to say it. She stopped at the end of her row and he looked up. "Jedediah," she said. He straightened. There was something in her voice that he had learned to attend to, a particular clarity that meant she was about to say something she had thought through completely. "I love you," she said, not loudly, clearly and directly, the way she did everything. "I am certain of it. I have been working up to being certain for 3 weeks and now I am, and I wanted to tell you as soon as I was." He stood very still for a moment, the hoe in his hand, the July sun on his face, and then he crossed the row between them and he took her face in his hands, and he looked at her for a moment, this man who was always so deliberate, taking one more deliberate moment, and then he kissed her. It was not the first kiss of strangers, but the first kiss of two people who already knew each other thoroughly, and it was warm and careful, and then, when she reached up and took hold of the front of his shirt, it was something else entirely, something that matched the size and steadiness of everything she had been feeling for months. When they stepped back, his hands were still in her hair, which had escaped her pins, and she was looking up at him with a face that felt completely open, which was unusual for her, and she thought, there it is, that is what it is. "I should like," he said a little unsteadily, "to ask you to marry me, but I want to do it properly, not standing in a cornfield." "I like cornfields," she said. "Martha," she laughed. "Ask me properly then," she said, "when you are ready." He was ready the following Sunday. He came to her house in the morning in his good coat, with his hat in his hands, and he knocked on the door as though he had not been through it 100 times, and when she opened it, he looked at her and said, "Martha Boone, I would like to ask whether you would consent to be my wife. I cannot promise you an easy life, because this is Kansas and this is the frontier and nothing here is easy, but I can promise you that I will be beside you for all of it, and that you will never face anything alone again, and that I will work every day to deserve you. I am asking you to build a life with me." She stood in her doorway in the early Sunday morning light and she looked at this man, this Jedediah Alden, who had lent her a plow and had not taken payment and had talked to her like a person, and had stood in the rain with her and had said, "I love you," and had waited 3 weeks for her to be certain, and had come to her door with his hat in his hands, and she thought, "This is the most unexpected thing that has ever happened to me." "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He exhaled, and she realized he had been holding it, which made her love him more. He came inside, and she made coffee, and they sat at her table and planned a life with the same practical directness that characterized both of them, and also with a joy that they did not hide from each other anymore. They agreed on a fall wedding, after the harvest, because neither of them would let a harvest suffer for anything. They agreed that she would move to his house because it was larger and more solid, and that her land would be farmed as a second property. They agreed that they wanted children if God allowed it, and that they would figure out the rest as they went. "There is one thing," she said. He looked at her. "I keep my own name professionally," she said. "In correspondence and in any business matters. Martha Boone Alden, not simply Mrs. Alden." He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, "I would not expect anything else." She felt a warmth at that went all the way through her. The summer moved with a sweet urgency toward the harvest, and they were both very busy, and the time apart was productive if not comfortable. And when they were together, it was with a new ease that came from the settled certainty of what they were to each other. There was joy in the work now, in the shared effort of two properties being managed toward a common future. And there was joy in the evenings and on Sundays. And there was joy in the small domestic intimacies of planning a shared life, going through what they each owned and deciding what would go in the house and what would be stored or given away. They had supper one evening with Reverend Coleman and his wife, who were quietly thrilled and very kind, and they went to town together one Saturday, and the whole of the small community seemed to take a collective satisfied breath, the widow Pearson most audibly of all. There was also the matter of the Dennison brothers. The Dennison brothers were two men, Harlan and Cecil, who had a claim on a piece of land adjacent to Martha's property, and who had never been quite content with the boundary lines as surveyed. Thomas Boone had had a running dispute with them about it that had never been properly resolved, and now that Martha was managing the property alone, and then in partnership with Jedediah, the brothers had apparently decided the time was ripe to press their case again. Harlan Dennison came to Martha's property in early August, when she was there doing some repair work on the storage shed, and he was unpleasant about it in the specific way of men who believe that a woman on her own is an opportunity. He stood at the edge of the field and said that as far as he was concerned the line was 10 feet further east than the survey showed, and that he intended to put up his own fence to reflect that. Martha told him, with exceptional calm, that the survey was filed with the county land office and that the recorded boundary was the boundary, and that any fence he built on her side of it would be removed. He said something then that was not aimed at the boundary at all, and she turned and walked back toward the house without responding, because she was not going to give a man like that the satisfaction. She told Jedediah about it that evening. His expression was very still. "Did he threaten you?" He said. "He was unpleasant," she said. "I do not frighten easily, and he did not frighten me. But I wanted you to know." Jedediah went to the county land office the next morning and came back with a certified copy of the original survey, which he then took to the Dennison property and presented to Harlan Dennison in a conversation that Martha was not present for, but which she understood, from the way Jedediah's hands were easy at his sides when he came back, had resolved the matter. He did not tell her exactly what was said, and she did not ask, but the Dennisons put up no fence and did not come to her property again. "You did not have to do that," she said, for the second time in their acquaintance. "I know," he said. "I did it because this is going to be my land too, and because that man needed to understand the situation clearly." "And did he?" "He did," Jedediah said, "and that was the end of it. The harvest came in September, and it was a good one. Her corn came up strong, and her vegetable garden had done well through the summer, and Jedediah's wheat was the finest in the county by the measurement of the mill operator, who said so publicly, with the pleasure of a man stating an obvious fact. They sold their crops and paid their debts and had more remaining than either of them had had at the beginning of the season. And when Martha looked at the numbers in her account book, She felt a solid, grounded satisfaction that was different from happiness, but was its own valuable thing. They were married in October, on a bright Saturday with a sky so blue it looked painted, in the little white church with every homesteader within 20 miles in attendance, and the widow Pearson weeping happily in the third pew and Reverend Coleman conducting the ceremony with a genuine joy that made him add several impromptu blessings that were not in the standard order of service. Martha wore a dress that she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from the catalog, a deep blue that was nearly gray, simple and well cut, and she carried a bunch of the late-season wildflowers from the riverbank where the cottonwoods grew. She stood at the altar and looked at Jedediah, who was in his good coat with a clean shirt and his hair combed, and who was looking at her with an expression that was not performing anything at all, that was entirely and simply love, and she thought, I walked 3 miles in the dust for a plow, and this is where that walk ended. When Reverend Coleman asked whether anyone knew a reason why these two should not be joined, the church was very quiet, and then someone in the back started to cry in a happy way, and the Reverend said with some amusement, I will take that as a no, and the congregation laughed, and Martha laughed, and Jedediah laughed, and then the Reverend asked Jedediah if he would take this woman, and Jedediah said I will in a voice that was steady and certain and low enough that it was almost just for her. When he asked Martha, she said I will in a voice that was equally certain and perhaps a little louder. The reception was held in the field beside the church, which was how it was done in that county, with long tables and dishes that everyone had brought, and music from a fiddle player named George who had one good leg and extraordinary talent, and dancing that started stiff and became increasingly enthusiastic as the afternoon wore on. Jedediah was not a natural dancer, but he was willing, and he had a good sense of rhythm, and they managed a respectable waltz together that caused more happy weeping from the widow Pearson. By the time the sun was setting and the guests were beginning to gather their families and start the rides home, Martha was sitting on the back of a wagon with her shoes off and her feet dangling and a piece of wedding cake in her hand, and Jedediah came and sat beside her, also slightly disheveled from an enthusiastic reel, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her and they sat and watched the last guests leave and the stars begin to come out. Mrs. Alden, he said. Martha Boone Alden, she corrected. Martha Boone Alden, he said. Are you happy? She thought about it the way she thought about everything with honesty. Yes, she said, I am very happy. Are you? Extraordinarily, he said. She turned her face into his shoulder and he held her tighter, and the Kansas night was very large and very quiet around them, and everything felt right in the specific way that things only feel right when you have earned them. The first year of their marriage was both the hardest and the best year Martha had known. Hard because the frontier demanded everything you had in every season without exception, and because running 2 properties together was a significant undertaking that required constant decision-making and physical labor and planning. Best because they did it together, and because together was a different country than alone. They established a rhythm quickly, because both of them were people who operated by rhythm and routine. Jedediah was up before dawn every morning and had coffee ready when Martha came through the kitchen, and she took over the accounts and the planning of both properties because she had a better head for numbers than he did, which he acknowledged without ego. He took the heavier physical work and the horse management, and she ran the kitchen garden and the household and kept the books, and the labor was divided by skill and inclination, and both of them understood that their arrangement was unusual by the standards of the time, but was the arrangement that made the most sense. There were the ordinary frictions of any 2 people learning to live in close quarters, small collisions of habit and expectation that had to be negotiated. She was a morning person, and he was most alert in the late afternoon, which meant that serious conversations went better if saved for 4 o'clock rather than right after waking. He had a habit of leaving his reading material on whatever surface was nearest when he set it down, and she had a corresponding need for surfaces to be clear, and they reached a compromise that was not entirely satisfying to either of them, and was therefore probably fair. He was patient with her in the ways that mattered, and she was not patient with herself in the ways that did not, and she was learning slowly that those were different things. When the nightmares came for him, she had learned to simply put her hand on his chest in the dark, not speaking, and the warmth of her there was what he needed, and he always said in the morning, "Thank you," without elaborating, and she always said, of course, without elaborating, and that was sufficient. In December, she began to suspect, and in January she was certain, and she told him on a cold evening while they sat by the fire with the wind driving snow against the windows, and he set down his book and looked at her with an expression that was so unguarded and so large that she felt it in her sternum. "Are you certain?" he said. "I am always certain before I say a thing," she said. He crossed the room and knelt in front of her chair and took both her hands in his, which was the most overtly dramatic gesture she had ever seen him make, and he looked up at her with eyes that were very bright. "We are going to have a child," he said, as though he needed to say it aloud to make it real. "We are going to have a child," she confirmed. He pressed her hands to his lips, which made her throat tight again in the way it always did when he was most himself. The pregnancy was not easy. Kansas winters were brutal and spring brought its own difficulties, and Martha was not a woman who slowed down gracefully or willingly. Jedediah watched her with a vigilance that she sometimes found exasperating and always found touching, and she compromised with him on the question of what she would and would not do by herself, which required actual negotiation, because she was not inclined to be treated as an invalid, and he was not inclined to let her be reckless. And eventually they arrived at an understanding that satisfied the important principles of both positions. He had a habit in those months of coming to find her in whatever part of the property she was in and simply being nearby, not hovering, not fussing, just present and available, working on whatever task was in the vicinity and occasionally saying something that had nothing to do with her condition, just ordinary conversation, as though his proximity were entirely coincidental. She knew it was not, and he knew she knew, and they maintained the fiction because it was kind. Their son was born in August, on a hot Tuesday morning with the summer pushing hard against the windows and the doctor from town in attendance, and it was difficult in the way that birth is difficult, and Martha went through it with her jaw set, and her hands in fists and her eyes focused on something interior that Jedediah could not see. And he stood where the doctor permitted him and held her hand when she would let him and said nothing that was inadequate, which was the most useful thing a person could do. The baby was loud immediately, which the doctor said was exactly right, and when they put him in Martha's arms she looked down at this face, red and furious and entirely new, and something happened to her that she could not have prepared for. The whole architecture of what she was shifted and rearranged itself to accommodate something she had not known was missing until it was suddenly present. "Jedediah," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. He was at her side immediately. He looked down at the baby, and his whole face did the thing she loved, the thing where every layer of composure was simply not relevant. "He looks like he has opinions," Jedediah said, which was the right thing to say. "He is a Boone Alden," Martha said. "Of course he has opinions." They named him Samuel Thomas Alden, the Thomas for her first husband, because Thomas had been a decent man and he was part of how she had come to be here, and Jedediah had suggested it himself, which told her something about who he was that she had already known but was glad to have confirmed. Samuel was the kind of baby who made his preferences known at volume, and the first months with him were an education in sleep deprivation and the remarkable capacity of love to persist under conditions of extreme exhaustion. Jedediah proved to be a natural father in the specific way of a man who had never expected to be one, but found that it suited him completely. He would walk Samuel in the dark when the crying was at its worst, making low wordless sounds, and Samuel would quiet in a way that he did for almost no one else, and Martha would watch them from the doorway of the bedroom. This man she loved carrying her son through the dark house, and she would feel something that was larger than happiness and more permanent. The frontier had no patience for the internal lives of its inhabitants, and the work continued as it always did, and they managed it with the improvisation that frontier life demanded. The widow Pearson, who had made herself something of a grandmother figure to the whole community, came out to help in those first weeks and was efficient and unsentimental and exactly what was needed. The years moved as years do in country places, not quickly but not slowly, with the seasons marking their turns and each year a little more settled, a little more built than the one before. In 1876, Jedediah expanded the South pasture and bought 3 more horses, and the horse breeding enterprise that he had been building quietly became a significant part of their income, because the horses he bred and trained were of exceptional quality, and there was a consistent market for them. Martha, who had always been good with numbers, took over the management of the horse sales completely within 2 years, and was widely known among the buyers who came through as a woman who knew the value of what she was selling and would not be underpaid for it. In 1877, they had a second child, another boy, who they named William James, who was built differently than Samuel from the very beginning, quieter and more watchful, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's tendency to think before speaking. Samuel by this point was 2 years old and had the personality of a very small and extremely certain man, and he received the arrival of William with a wariness that eventually gave way to a proprietary affection that was one of the funniest and most touching things his parents had ever witnessed. The property expanded again in 1878, when the land adjacent to theirs became available after the Dennison brothers, who had given them no trouble since the incident with the survey, decided to move further west. Jedediah bought the land without the Dennisons knowing he was the buyer, and Martha had a moment of sharp amusement when she found out because she recognized the particular satisfaction of it. That was slightly vengeful, she told him. It was a good business decision, he said. It was both, she said. He almost smiled. It was both, he agreed. That fall in 1878, they went to town for the Harvest Social, which was a yearly event that had grown over the years into something genuinely festive, with more families in the county now, and the town having expanded to include a proper school, a second dry goods store, and a new hotel. Martha wore a dress she had made from ordering the finest fabric from the catalog, and Jedediah wore his best coat, which he had replaced the previous year, and Samuel, who was 4, wore a miniature version of his father's clothes that Martha had made, and that caused considerable comment from the women of the community. They danced together that night as they had at their wedding, though much better now, because 4 years of occasional practice had given Jedediah more confidence, and Martha had relaxed her tendency to lead, and they moved together with the easy attunement of people who had learned each other's rhythms in every sense. The fiddle player was George again, still one-legged and extraordinary, and the fire from the barrels was warm and the night was cold, and the stars were very bright, and Martha stood beside her husband at the edge of the dancing, and watched their son be swung around by a delighted couple from the next farm, and she thought, this is the life that was on the other side of that walk. She thought about it sometimes, the walk. The morning she had set out with her bonnet tied under her chin, and her purpose very clear, and no idea at all of what she was walking toward. She thought about the gate, and the man who had come around the corner of the barn with a saddle blanket over one arm and the word charity and how she had refused it. She mentioned it to Jedediah one evening quietly after the boys were in bed and the house was settled into its nighttime quiet. I have been thinking about the plow, she said. He looked at her from across the fire, one eyebrow slightly raised. Not the plow specifically, she said. The morning I came to borrow it. I was thinking about what I knew then and what I know now and how different those two things are. He was quiet for a moment, his eyes on her. What did you know then? He said. I knew I needed a plow, she said. I knew I was going to manage. I knew I was not going to ask for anything I could not find a way to repay. She paused. I did not know you existed. I knew a woman named Martha Boone had property about 3 miles west, he said. I had heard the name. I did not know you existed either. Not really. We walked toward each other from a great distance, she said. We did, he said. And you needed a plow and I had one. His voice was warm with it, the way it was when he found something both ordinary and profound. It seems like a small thing, she said, to hinge everything on. Nothing is small if it is the thing that starts it, he said. She looked at him across the room, this man who was so reliably right about the important things, and she loved him in the specific and solid way that comes not from the beginning of love but from years of it. From all the mornings and evenings and difficult seasons and good harvests and babies in the dark and small arguments and large agreements that build, stone by stone, the edifice of a life shared. I left with more than a plow, she said. He smiled, the full smile, the one she had first seen on the day she returned the cornbread, and it still did exactly what it had done then. You did, he said. In 1879, the schoolhouse was expanded, and a permanent teacher was hired. A young woman from Ohio named Miss Ansley who was serious and competent. And Samuel began attending, and came home every day with the evangelical enthusiasm of someone who had just discovered that the world was full of things to learn about. Martha sat with him in the evenings and helped with the reading, which he took to like it was something he had been waiting for. And she thought of herself at his age, devouring her father's small collection of books, and felt the particular pleasure of seeing something of yourself in a child. William was 2 and still mostly interested in the horses and in dirt, both of which he pursued with single-minded commitment. The following spring, Martha discovered she was pregnant again. She told Jedediah in the morning over coffee before Samuel was up, and he looked at her across the table with a steadiness that contained everything she needed to see. How do you feel about it? He said. I feel that we will manage, she said. And that 3 is a good number. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. 3 is a good number, he agreed. This pregnancy was easier than the first 2, or she was more experienced with it, or she simply had less capacity for difficulty with 2 boys and 2 properties, and a horse-breeding enterprise to manage. She moved through the months with her characteristic efficiency, making adjustments where required and accepting help with less argument than she had previously, which Jedediah noted without comment, knowing that commenting would be the surest way to end it. Their daughter was born in December of 1880, 3 days before Christmas, and she was the most immediately opinionated of the 3 children, which was a considerable achievement given the competition. They named her Clara Ann Alden, for no one in particular, simply because it was a name that suited what they saw, which was a child with very dark eyes and an expression of alert assessment that she had apparently brought with her from wherever babies came from. Samuel, who was 6, declared himself Clara's protector with an authority that was both charming and slightly unnecessary, and William, who was 3, looked at her for a long time with great seriousness and then said, "She is very loud," which was accurate. Christmas that year was the fullest the house had ever been. The widow Pearson came, as she did every year now, and Reverend Coleman and his wife, and 3 neighboring families with their children, and the house was bright and crowded and loud with children and the smell of the things Martha had been cooking for 2 days, and Jedediah stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and looked at it all with an expression that she caught from across the room. She made her way to him, carrying Clara, and stood beside him in the doorway. "What are you thinking?" she said, using his own question back at him. He looked down at her, at Clara in her arms, and out at the room full of people and warmth and noise. "I am thinking," he said, "that I would not change a single thing." She leaned against his arm. "Not even the nightmares," she said. "Not even those," he said, "because they are part of how I got here." She looked up at him. "Jedediah Alden," she said. "Martha Boone Alden," he said. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said, and she laughed, because it was an echo of something he had said to her once, very early. And he always said it this way when she told him, as a kind of private joke between them that was also not entirely a joke, because with Martha Boone Alden, knowing was always the thing. He kissed her briefly and completely, and Clara made a sound of protest at being squeezed, and from across the room Samuel said, "Papa," in a tone of mild outrage at the public display, and William said, without looking up from the wooden horse he was examining, "They do that," in a tone of resignation beyond his years. The guests laughed, and the fire was bright, and outside the Kansas night was cold and vast and full of stars. The years after that were the years of building and being and knowing, of the particular satisfaction of a life that was exactly what it should be because you had made it so with effort and honesty, and the willingness to walk 3 miles in the dust for a practical thing and receive in exchange something incalculable. The farm grew prosperous enough by 1882 that they could hire 2 hands, brothers named Eli and Frank Hawkins, good workers and decent men, and the arrangement freed Jedediah for the horse breeding work that had become his particular skill and passion, and freed Martha for the management side, and freed them both for the small daily luxury of an hour in the evening that was theirs alone, after the children were in bed, to sit together by the fire or on the porch depending on the season. They went on talking, for years and years, about books, which they continued to read and argue about with the same pleasure as at the beginning. About the land and what it was becoming, because Kansas in the early 1880s was changing. More people, more towns, more roads, the railroad pushing into territories that had been open range, and they watched it with the mixed feelings of people who had been there early enough to remember the rawness of it and had complicated affections for what it was becoming. They talked about the children and the children's futures and what they hoped those futures might look like, and they talked about the past sometimes, carefully and honestly, because both of them had histories that had shaped them and neither of them believed in pretending otherwise. Martha spoke of Thomas occasionally, not often, but when she did, Jedediah listened without discomfort, because he was not a man who required the erasure of what came before, and she loved him for it specifically. He spoke of the war rarely, and she never pressed, but when he did speak of it, she listened with the same quality of attention that she gave to everything important, complete, and without judgment. Samuel turned 10 in 1883. And by then he was already clearly going to be a reader and a thinker, the kind of boy who collected questions the way other boys collected stones. William at 8 was going to be something physical and practical, already more comfortable with the horses than anyone except his father, with a natural quiet authority with the animals that Jedediah recognized and nurtured. Clara at 3 was going to be, it was very clear, entirely herself, with a will that was entirely her mother's and a warmth that was her own particular addition to the family's character. Martha stood one morning in the kitchen of her house, the house that had once been Jedediah Alden's house and was now theirs in every sense, looking out the window at the Kansas morning, at the fields and the paddocks and the barn, at the huge sky that stretched from horizon to horizon with uncompromised magnificence. She had a cup of coffee in her hand and she could hear Jedediah outside, talking to one of the horses in the low voice he used with them. And from the back of the house, she could hear Samuel reading something aloud to William, who was tolerating it, and Clara was still asleep. She thought, as she sometimes did, about the woman who had walked down this road 7 years before in the summer of 1874, with her bonnet tied tight and her purpose clear, and her world reduced to the immediate problem of a broken plow and 40 acres needing breaking. That woman had been brave and capable and determined, and she had also been in the early stages of grief and was not sure whether she was fully intact. She was fully intact now, more than intact. She was built, with this man and these children and this land, into something that was grounded and certain and wide. She heard the door open and close, and Jedediah came into the kitchen, still in his working clothes from the early morning, and he went to the stove and poured himself coffee without speaking, and then he came and stood beside her at the window and looked out at what she was looking at. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. They stood there together looking at their land, shoulder to shoulder, and the morning came on with its unhurried light, and there was nothing that needed to be said that had not already been said, and nothing that needed to be resolved that was not already resolved, and nothing that had been promised on that long-ago morning when a woman came to borrow a plow and left with something she had not expected, that had not been fully and completely kept. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into it, and they drank their coffee in the morning quiet, and the Kansas sky above them was enormous and brilliant and entirely their own. Sometime later, long after the coffee had gone cold and the morning had properly begun, and the children had come tumbling into the kitchen with their various needs and opinions, Martha looked at Jedediah across the room and found him already looking at her, and she thought, with a certainty that was the deepest kind, that this was the shape of all the remaining mornings, and that it was exactly right, and that she was grateful in a way that went past the word and into the thing itself. For a broken plow and a long walk, and a man who had stood at a gate and opened it. The cottonwood trees at the river bend still turned green every spring without fail, and every spring they rode out to see them, just the two of them, as they had the first time, though now there were 3 more horses in the paddock, and 3 more voices in the house, and 3 more hearts that had been added to the enterprise of their life together. The plow, the original one that Jedediah had lent her, still sat in the corner of the barn. He had never gotten rid of it, and she had never asked him to, and they never spoke about why it was still there. They both knew. Some things are too much themselves to put away. In the summer of 1884, Samuel found it while looking for something in the barn, and he asked his father what it was doing there, since it looked older than the working plows and was not in use. Jedediah looked at it for a long moment, and then he said, "That is the plow that your mother came to borrow before I knew her. It is the reason you exist." Samuel looked at the plow and then at his father with the expression of someone encountering a fact that was both very ordinary and very large. "A plow," he said. "A plow," Jedediah confirmed. Samuel thought about this for a moment with the particular seriousness he brought to important things. "I think we should keep it," he said. "We are going to keep it," Jedediah said. "We always were." Samuel nodded, satisfied with this, and went off to whatever he had been looking for, and Jedediah stood in the barn with the old plow and the long afternoon light coming through the boards, and he felt, as he frequently did in the quiet moments, the full weight and warmth of everything that had accumulated between one ordinary September morning and this present moment, and he thought it was the finest thing he had ever been part of, the whole accumulation of it. The love and the labor and the seasons and the children, and the woman who had come to his gate with her bonnet straight, and her chin up, and her refusal to accept anything that was not properly earned. He went inside to find her, and she was at the table with the account books, working through the numbers for the fall horse sale, and she looked up when he came in, and he looked at her and she said, "What?" Because she could always read him, and he said, "Nothing." And she looked at him for a moment longer, and then she smiled, the real smile, the one she had saved for him since the beginning, and she went back to her numbers, and he sat down across from her and opened his book, and the evening came on around them, warm and settled and complete. This was the promise she had not expected. Not the words of it, spoken on that porch on a summer evening years before, but the whole of it, every day of it, this man beside her in the ordinary light. It was, she thought, as she ran a column of figures and heard the children's voices from outside and felt the solid presence of her husband across the table, exactly enough. More than enough. The right and entire thing. The Kansas night came on, and the stars appeared one by one above the wide frontier, above the house and the barn and the fields and the horses and the 3 sleeping children and the old plow in the corner, above Martha Boone Alden and Jedediah Alden sitting in the lamplight together. And the world went about its permanent and unhurried work, and everything was well.